I've been doing various forms of breath work since 2002. So 23 years. God, that makes me feel really old. 23 years of various kinds of breath work. And I saw the Breathe Way Better and I was like, I need this. I need this tool and I want to get into it right now.
The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all one place, zorfitness.com. So I guess like the first thing is like, like what makes this unique? Like, why can't someone just like breathe? Like, why do they need a device at all? Right? If it's I think something like a power lung, okay, it restricts your airflow. Whereas Breathe Way Better doesn't restrict your airflow. So it's like what's the point?
Yeah, so it's a much more complicated device in terms of like the mechanism of how it works than like a power lung. Power lung just closes down the breathing airway. Essentially,
it's like straw.
Yeah. You're essentially like recreating what happens when you have asthma and then trying to breathe through it. With a Breathe Way Better, it's a really complicated mechanism. So I say it's complicated. It's not really. There's a big balloon, all right? And when you exhale into that balloon, it fills it with your own carbon dioxide. And then it has a little hole on the top. And when you inhale, you're breathing in a mixture of your exhaled carbon dioxide and nitric oxide and oxygen, all the other stuff that you breathe out. But then you're also getting some fresh air through the tiny little hole at the top of the device. And so you're getting this mix of fresh air and expired CO2. So what it allows you to do is it allows you to breathe at really high respiration rates when you're at rest. So sitting here, if I were to breathe at the same rate that I did during exercise, like I would just pass out because I would blow off all my CO2. And it happens when someone hyperventilates a lot, like they get lightheaded and then, it progresses down. It's like lightheaded, dizzy, and then boom. They're passed out. So what it does is it allows you to essentially breathe at these really high respiration rates while you're sitting, while you're doing, it can get way more fancy than just sitting, but at rest. And as a result, you can train the endurance of the respiratory system. And there's one other really important factor that differentiates it from something like a power lung. When you're training with respiratory resistance training tools, right, where you're breathing through a straw, essentially, you are stiffening the diaphragm. So your primary breathing muscle, is located right here at the bottom of the ribs. You're stiffening that diaphragm and you're training it in a shortened range of motion. Now, if you don't know a ton about muscle physiology, it's not going to mean that much to you. But if you know a little bit about how muscles operate, they operate in kind of these optimal ranges of motion. And if you train your diaphragm in this shortened range of motion, it's going to stiffen. And if your diaphragm's stiffer, it means it's going to be a lot harder to breathe, even though your diaphragm is stronger, which will be good for like bracing and, maybe powerlifting. Training with a respiratory resistance device may actually make breathing more challenging over time. Now, there's a lot of research that suggests that they work, but if you look at the research on things like an isocapnic trainer, like a Breathe Way Better, for any type of endurance activity, it's way more effective at reducing the energy cost of breathing because you're training it to be more flexible, to move through full ranges of motion, and then you're training at the same rates that you are when you're, at high intensity exercise, So if you're running 800 meters, you're breathing at like 45 to 55 breaths per minute. With a power lung, you're going to train at like 10 breaths per minute. And with a Breathe Way Better device, you're going to be training at 50 or 55 breaths per minute. So training the exact ranges of motion and respiration rates that you're going to be using during high intensity exercise.
Yeah. Yeah. Beyond just like being at the specific cadences, or any like special way to breathe while you're using it?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've had a lot of athletes who have used them at this point, and I think the biggest mistakes that people make are that they tend to just breathe at whatever the prescribed cadence is, rather than trying to maximize inhale and exhale at the prescribed cadence. Now, again, this is going to be a little bit more complicated than just, breathe deep and breathe fast. But in the end, that's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to breathe as deeply in and out as you possibly can as fast as you can so that you're exchanging the maximal amount of air within a minute, right? So I've tended to think about now the Breathe Way Better as if it's similar to like rowing or swimming or running, where you have stride rate and you have stride length, or you have stroke rate and stroke length. It's very similar. Our goal is to maximize the amount of air that we're exchanging with the environment so we can maximize oxygen uptake. That's one part of the VO2 equation is, how much oxygen you're utilizing inside the tissues during exercise. But one of the rate limiting steps can be how much oxygen you're intaking, right? And so what I'm trying to do is get people to basically breathe as much out and in as possible with each breath at the highest respiratory frequency they can. So they're maximizing oxygen exchange with the environment, and therefore there's no limitation in VO2 max at the lung. But for most of us, especially that are like CrossFitters, right, I think that there can be an exchange limitation because we do have really high oxygen utilization from the way that we train, but we're limited. So many people will say that, I feel like I'm suffocated, I'm limited by my breathing, I'm limited by the ability to just get more air in and out of the body. That's the limitation. So when you're using it, you want to breathe with as much volume as you can at your target respiration rates. The other thing you want to do is you want to make sure that in general at lower respiration rates, you're breathing diaphragm first, where you are breathing with good mechanics. I think just like anything, just like any training tool, with a barbell, we establish good mechanics first. With a Breathe Way Better, you want to establish good breathing mechanics first, and then you progress your way up into higher intensities and frequencies.
Yeah, makes sense. So, as I said, yeah, you're a coach. So, like, for yourself as an athlete or for the other people you coach, like, what are the main use cases that you found are best for your population that you're working with?
Well, I think for people like myself who have existing exercise-induced asthma, it's a really powerful tool. I was talking to Luke Way, the inventor and owner of the Breathe Way Better, and we were talking about isocapnic training just in general. And one of the things he was telling me is that, I don't remember if it was in France or Sweden, but they're now adopting that as one of the frontline treatments for exercise-induced asthma, because what it's allowing people to do is, one, train the endurance of the respiratory system so that it's a little bit less reactive, but also improve just the gas exchange inside of the lungs. And so you're building up some nitric oxide and CO2, which dilates the airways that basically get constricted during exercise-induced asthma. So it's one of those ways that I think that's like use case number one is any athletes who have this sort of like really reactive Fran lung type physiology. You're one of them, having worked with you for a while with it. I'm definitely one of them. I work with, I coach 30 athletes, and I'd say that like 10 out of the 30 are people who fall into that sort of reactive airway physiology. And so they're like the front line of who should be using a Breathe Way Better. And it's a much better device for this than a power lung, because rather than just strengthening the breathing, what you're doing is you're actually you're affecting the gases that are in there so that you're dilating the airways and improving the endurance of the airways. So that's like number one. I think anybody who's a high level competitive CrossFitter could potentially benefit from using a Breathe Way Better. A lot of times they're going to end up being respiratory limited when they get to the highest levels that they can in the sport, and they've, kind of maximized their physiology. So VO2 max is trainable, right? But there's like a ceiling to how trainable it is. And once they've got to the point where they've kind of pushed their VO2 max up against their ceiling, like there's very little in terms of oxygen utilization that they can improve. They can still improve oxygen uptake, and they tend to be very respiratory limited, where they end up with this another complicated thing, but it's called a respiratory metaboreflex, where you reach really severe intensities of exercise and your body starts to pull blood away from your working muscles and shuttle it to the diaphragm and the breathing muscles, basically to keep you alive. Like that's the entire goal, is to shuttle blood from working tissues to breathing muscles to make sure that you have enough air to breathe and keep your brain alive. And so they're capable of pushing themselves to this point where they start to suck air or suck oxygen and blood out of their tissues. And training with a Breathe Way Better can make it so that the diaphragm's more enduring. So the point at which they reach this respiratory metabolic reflex is pushed up. And so I think for very high level CrossFitters, this is a fantastic tool for that. Then the other major use case that I see are just endurance athletes in general. I think that's the group that where this was sort of invented and like its intended purpose. They're going to benefit. The cool thing is once someone gets a Breathe Way Better and they start using it it's not a long time. It's like 5 sessions. Like, oh, I already feel this improving my running.
Yeah, it's a very direct correlation.
Yeah, I think it's one of those tools like BFR. You feel working in the sense that it hurts right away.
It's super painful right away.
Yeah, but you don't necessarily feel working in terms of the adaptations for some weeks.
The carryover isn't as immediate, maybe.
Yeah, with a Breathe Way Better, even within the first session. I mean, my wife started using it. She was training for High Rocks. And she used it for one session because I've been telling her like, hey, we got to get you one of these. You need to try this. It's crazy. You'll feel so good. She used it for one session, was like, wow, my session was so easy. And I was like, well, I think it might be because you're using something like a Breathe Way Better now. And it really does have that sort of immediate impact in terms of that's a completely different mechanism than any of the ones we've talked about. That's a CO2 tolerance mechanism, I think. But it really does have a good impact there.
Yeah. And the other thing is like that now that I've implemented in a good chunk of my warm-ups, it's amazing how like, if I'm doing some like traditional, method of like CO2 tolerance, what you would have to be like a slower cadence. But with the isocapnic, obviously you can breathe at the respiration rate you want to exercise at. So then it also like you're putting way more horsepower just into generating that exchange of gas. And so you're literally like doing a warm up as you're just sitting there.
Yeah, it's one of those tools where I think for high level CrossFitters, what it allows you to do is it allows you've got 9 events over the course of a weekend or 8 events over the course of the weekend. And each one of those you have to warm up. And if you can warm up for 20 minutes instead of 30 minutes, then you've cut off essentially 80 minutes of warm up time across the weekend. And that's just that much less volume that your body has to deal with across the weekend. So using tools like the Breathe Way Better as a way to warm up the respiratory system, so you don't have to do 10 minutes on the bike every single time. You can do 5 minutes on the bike and 5 minutes of Breathe Way Better, and you've just made it so there's less wear and tear across the weekend. Man, incredibly valuable tool. Don't publish that. Don't let everyone know about this about this secret. We don't want everyone to know.
Behind the paywall. So if someone's like moving it into warm-ups and cool-downs, like what might be the next step of integration for, let's say, like a hybrid endurance athlete?
Yeah, I think the steps of integration from at least from my perspective are start with the warm-up. I think the warm-up is a great tool for establishing mechanics like we talked about. The first thing you have to do is you have to learn how to breathe well. And I think the Breathe Way Better is a great feedback tool because you can see how much it's inflating and deflating. You're sitting, you're not active, so you can feel like, is my diaphragm expanding or am I like breathing into my upper chest and traps and like shrugging with each breath? It's really easy to see all of that at rest. So you use the warm-up protocol to start with that. Plus, then it gets people very comfortable with starting to breathe at higher respiration rates. And I think the first layer is kind of getting the mechanics right and getting coordination. Like you've used it, and one of the things that you probably notice is the first time you're breathing at like 55 or 60 breaths per minute, you're like, this feels a little uncoordinated. Like I feel like I'm going to skip a breath, or it just doesn't feel like you're very familiar with that feeling, because every time you touch those respiration rates in exercise, you have to stop shortly afterward. You're like, I can't maintain this, so I have to slow down. So it lets you build some coordination at these higher respiration rates. And I think that's kind of layer one. After that, what I like to do is use it as like a pre-exercise prep tool. So we've done our 5-minute warm-up, but then we're going to start doing it as part of our specific warm-up. So you might do a 60-second interval of Breathe Way Better, where you start at 20 breaths per minute, and then at the 20-second mark go to 30 breaths per minute, and then at the 40-second mark go to 40 breaths per minute. So you're basically like ramping up very quickly and then going right into your thruster, burpee, echo interval. And so I think that's kind of like your next stage integration. Then once you've done that for a while and people are pretty comfortable with it, then I start to put it in as post-interval work. And that is the most uncomfortable thing that you can do with the Breathe Way Better, because what's happening is you build up all this metabolic CO2 and it's still captured inside your bloodstream and inside the lungs. And then you immediately grab the Breathe Way Better and start rebreathing that in the balloon. And the result of that is that you're building up CO2 levels in the blood and the brain very quickly. And the symptoms of that are the same symptoms that you get during really high intensity exercise. Like you start to feel like there's a sense of panic and like the walls are closing in and like you feel this tension. But what you're trying to train people to do with these post exercise Breathe Way Better intervals is to raise their CO2 tolerance, to make it so that their nervous system just says, oh, this level of CO2 is okay and I'm okay with it. And they're just becoming more and more and more comfortable with higher levels of CO2. And then one of my other favorite ones is and I didn't come up with this protocol at all. This was just kind of built in with the Breathe Way Better, but it's the isocapnic cool down. And basically what it does is it slowly raises CO2 levels over like 5 minutes or so. And by doing that, you're dilating all of the blood vessels in your whole body, because CO2 is a really powerful vasodilator. And so it's basically like a great way to do a cool down without having to get on a bike and spin for 10 or 15 minutes to really get the same effect. It just kind of dilates all the blood vessels in the whole body, helps you get blood and oxygen and nutrients to those tissues when you're done. Everyone who's used that isocapnic cool down, once they get used to the elevated CO2 levels, they're like, man, I feel so recovered after I use this.
Yeah, interesting. What did I miss?
I think using the Breathe Way Better to build CO2 tolerance is probably one of the more valuable, aspects of it. It's just not one of the first things that you can do. Everyone in the breathwork community is really into CO2 tolerance and breath holds and things like that right now. And I think one of the cool things about the Breathe Way Better is you can build CO2 tolerance without doing breath holds. So for all of us that are competitive exercisers in some way, whether it's running or swimming or whatever, there's a little breath holding involved in swimming, but there's no breath holding involved in any other sport. Like it's just not something that you do unless maybe you're like bracing for, half of a second in the bottom of a thruster or something like that. But there's no like active breath holds. And so we're all building up excess CO2 metabolically and then having to exercise through that increased CO2. And I think that what the Breathe Way Better allows us to do is to build up CO2 where we're not having to do breath holds. And so you're separating that like breath hold panic feeling of increased CO2 from holding your breath. And I think it's a really valuable tool that people, I think when the breathwork community gets a hold of it, it's gonna be popularized very quickly.
Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.